have a clear class analysis and critique of policies that benefit corporate America at the expense of the working class. Because unions, particularly in the public sector, remain as the only force in opposition to the gutting of public services for other working class people, we're facing organized, systemic, and decorated real pretty attacks on our right to collectively bargain over our work and over the services that our people, our communities deserve. One of the latest attacks this summer, Iowans, I know we have brothers and sisters here from Iowa and District 7, saw their legislator gut collective bargaining against public workers. It limits contract negotiations to base wages with capped increases. It bars unions from negotiating on things like health insurance, valuation procedures, and staff reductions. It bars payroll deduction. And requires recertification prior to every contract negotiation. What is happening in the public sector is not a mistake. This Iowa law didn't just happen like the weather. This is literally the result of organizing by the 1%. This, namely here in this case, I'll use that as an example, David and Charles Koch, members of the Koch family, who have amassed, 4 members of their family, have amassed $82 billion in wealth. $82 billion. That's more than the cost, according to a study by AFT, $82 billion is more than it costs to pay every single kindergarten school teacher's salary for 8 years. The 1% is real. The attack the 1% is waging on the working class is real. Their impact and influence is real. In Iowa, again, it's not a mistake. In Iowa, the Kochs alone spent $3.4, almost $3.5 million in 2014 to re-elect the governor that signed that bill, to elect Senator Joni Ernst, who ran against the minimum wage and ran against the Affordable Care Act. The Americans for Prosperity, talk about decorated real pretty, Americans for Prosperity, that sounds good. Made over 700,000 phone calls, knocked on over 50,000 doors, and sent over 300,000 mailers to Iowans. They have over 30 people working there and 5 field offices in Iowa. What is happening to the public sector is not a mistake. A looming Supreme Court decision is just as orchestrated as this Iowa bill, and it's not a mistake. The fact that it's harder to form and join a union today and bargain and enforce a good contract is not a mistake. That the federal minimum wage languishes at $7.25 an hour is not a mistake. That the average class of 2016 graduate has $40,000 in student loan debt is not a mistake. I'm one of those. And $40,000, anyway, never mind. That many Democrats, for too long, have paid lip service to working class people, only to turn around and execute the policies of the 1% is not a mistake. That an anti-union, anti-worker, racist, misogynist, homophobic, xenophobic billionaire is elected president who has no values other than enriching himself by prescribing the wrong remedy for the very real ailments of working class people is not a mistake. The 1% are organizing, but so are we. And to that end, the CWA Strong campaign is aimed at building our union internally and growing power. A signed membership card on its own is not power. It's an indication, right? It helps. It can correlate. It can provide some indication, but in itself, it is not power. Power for our movement only comes when we as a working class are mobilized to take our fair share. It won't be given. When a new member says, hey, what's this steward thing? Can I become a steward? That's where an opportunity for power occurs. When that sister who's been a member for years goes to a pension rally, but then goes to the Women's March, that's where working class power is built. When an organizer signs up a new member, not because that person wanted an insurance policy, but because they wanted to join the labor movement, that's power. CWA Strong is about building political consciousness of our working brothers and sisters, and we shouldn't be afraid to say so, and we shouldn't be afraid to say working class. And this isn't about political, as in Democratic and Republican, this and that. CWA Strong is about addressing the root of our problems by engaging and sharing how only a worker-led movement can make real change. So I encourage folks, we have a very condensed schedule, and I would have loved to run through some of it, but I want to encourage folks to reach out to their district offices if you're not from the public sector. I know there's some folks from other from districts in here, but also for to reach out to your district, reach out to our office to get more information on the training. And whether folks have their training or not, if they're local, I ask that, unapologetically, we start to think about talking to our brothers and sisters about a working class movement and what side we're on. So with that, I now have the pleasure of introducing one of our brothers in this movement for social and economic justice, who ran on a campaign on issues of the working class and called it as such, emphatically. Chokew Antar Lamumba, this summer, Mayor Lamumba was elected as mayor of the city of Jackson. And Mississippi has been a place that has been the heart of resistance and continues to be as such in race and labor issues. Think about this. The legacy of resistance in Mississippi lies in part with workers, enslaved African workers, who produced a global commodity that impacted markets from the United States to Europe. And even in the darkest and most heinous of circumstances, historians have accounts of strikes from slaves. That's right. An act demonstrating the innate will for human dignity. A state that almost immediately after the Civil War saw its first union of, does anyone know? Washerwomen, black washerwomen. And where and after the Civil War, where black sharecroppers and white tenant farmers joined the Southern Tenant Farmers Union to stand against the greed of landowners. This is also a state where people did not stop seeking civil rights when 3 organizers were murdered during Freedom Summer. No, they continued. It's at the heart of worker resistance. In 1989, state workers who were the lowest paid in the nation formed the Mississippi Alliance of State Employees. In 2006, 1,200 workers gained CWA representation, but yet the average city worker in Jackson makes about $10 an hour. But CWA members in Jackson, inspired by Mayor Lumumba's message of economic, social, and racial justice, knocked on doors, had one-on-one conversations, held a political internal organizing boot camp, and our struggle still continues as a union down there. We are working closely together with Mayor Lamumba, as he is only about a month into his term, to ensure that the workers of the city of Jackson get their fair share. Before being elected, Mayor Lamumba worked as a civil rights attorney and a leading advocate for justice in the South. While he ran for mayor in 2016 and 17, he made an active effort to seek out the support of CWA members who supported him with dozens of volunteer shifts. Mayor Lamumba then went on to win the Democratic primary with 55% of the vote in an 8-person race against the incumbent and outspent by 2 other candidates. Brother Lamumba is continuing his late father's legacy, who was also the former mayor of Jackson and a civil rights attorney, who died only 6 months into his term, and who courageously also champions for justice, including winning freedom for the unjustly sentenced Scott sisters, who received double life sentences for their role in a robbery of $11. Thanks to the efforts of both father and son, the sisters were freed in January 2011. Mayor Lamumba is closely aligned with the Jackson chapter of the Malcolm X grassroots movement. He and his allies are at the forefront of discussions around worker ownership and industrial democracy and the inherent ties between racial and economic justice. As the movement grows in Mississippi, Mayor Lumumba has been an ally of the union drives, both with CWA and the UAW's push to finally to organize Nissan, which unfortunately we learned this weekend that vote did not prevail. Mayor Lumumba has committed to a pro-labor agenda of raising wages for public employees, supporting the rights for workers to collectively bargain and end the unfair furloughs that the previous administration had put in place, which balanced the budget of the city on workers' backs. He has pledged to make Jackson the most radical city on the planet. Saying he's not afraid of the term radical because a radical, he argues, is someone who cares enough about their circumstances that they want to see changed. And if they look at their conditions and their communities need change and their cities need change, that we all need to be prepared as radical as the circumstances dictate we should be. And with that, I introduce Jackson Mayor Chokew Antar Lamumba.
Good morning. I think we can do a little better than that. Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is one of those circumstances where I believe that the introduction will probably be better than the keynote address. So, no, I thank Melissa for that kind introduction. I'd also like to express my gratitude to President Shelton and to Brooke Sunkett and CWA in its entirety for its support. I do want to talk about the campaign again briefly as I lead into the remarks that I have for you today, and I promise that I will be brief. I know that it is a tight day and there are a number of things that have to happen today, and I have to catch a flight back home. But first and foremost, I'm always, when I meet people, they're always struck by how young I look, right? And they talk about the fact that I'm young, so I hate to have to correct because it goes into the same vein, but I'm only 34, actually. Oh, okay. But as I remind people, I tell them as we look at our president, President Trump, who is not the youngest of individuals, I say that age is not a measure of maturity, right? A person's background and the history that they demonstrate should be the example by which we measure maturity. And so we have old fools as we have young fools, right? So we took on this campaign, and this was a people's campaign. Not a campaign that I can take exclusive ownership over because it was a campaign that was generated over years and years of organizing. I'm the son of two organizers. My parents moved to Jackson, Mississippi in 1988. Not because we had a great aunt that lived in Mississippi, not because my grandparents or my cousins lived in Mississippi. In fact, we have no blood relation in Mississippi. But my father did work in the 70s in Mississippi, working to change people's conditions. And so after he returned back to Detroit, Michigan, where he finished acquiring his law degree and did some work in Brooklyn, New York for a while, and had gained his family, my parents were looking for a slower pace, and so they decided that they wanted to move down south. And after having a little debate of where they would go, my father said, we have to go to Mississippi because we have unfinished business there. And so my parents made the powerful and courageous decision to not only commit themselves to a movement, but to commit their most precious resource, their family, to a movement. And so they gave us a sense of community. They gave us a sense of a greater purpose, and I'm grateful for them for that decision. Please, if you don't mind, give them a round of applause. So in this campaign, we ultimately faced a field of more than 13 candidates. As Melissa mentioned, in the Democratic primary, we faced 10 opponents, and were able to win with 55% of the vote and no runoff. We won the general election by 94% of the vote. And I mention that not so that you applaud the efforts of my campaign, but that you applaud yourself. Because we would not be able to have accomplished any of it had it not been for the efforts and support of CWA. So please give yourselves a round of applause. We understood that we stood a good chance of winning this election, that we spoke to politics and we represented an idea that people supported. But we also represented this idea of changing the scope of electoral politics. No longer allowing someone to step up and create an agenda that we accept as a people, but teaching our people to adopt an agenda for yourselves and draft the leadership that represents your agenda. And because we represented such a radical idea, the institutions that have been raping and pillaging the city for many years did not support us. And so it was no short or small task that CWA stepped up to the plate and decided to support us. Had it not been for CWA, we would not have had the resources necessary to get our message out. And so we're grateful for that support. We're grateful for the willingness to stand behind radical ideas. And so we are on a mission. We are on a mission where we want to see Jackson, Mississippi, which has been known for some of the most heinous acts in the history of the world. Now we're on a mission to be the model, to be the example of what a progressive administration can accomplish. And in fact, we believe that it must be us. That it must come out of Mississippi, which has demonstrated so many of these heinous acts, because so long as we have a Mississippi, so long as there are havens of oppression where we can exploit workers, where we can take advantage of people and live in some of the most oppressive conditions, that it becomes a threat and a danger to workers everywhere. We talk about the Nissan workers and how they failed to unionize. They failed on the vote, and we're greatly disappointed in that failure. But it truly speaks to the dynamics of what we're seeing. It truly speaks to how Mississippi becomes important more than just to the South, but to everyone. I'm a child of history, and I like to speak honestly, so I hope that you will allow me to do so today. We're living in a day and time where to speak truth is considered a revolutionary act, right? But you have me up here now, so I'm going to speak truth, all right? As we really look at the history of this country, and Melissa spoke briefly about the institution of slavery and the impact that it had. If we take an honest assessment of what slavery was, it was the worst workers' policy and decision our country has ever seen. And so the decision of Northern sympathizers to support a war to end slavery was more than just about a compassion for black workers that they had never met. It was also sympathizing with themselves, understanding that they could not live, that they could not support themselves, battling with an institution that was able to exploit, rape, and torture cheap labor. And the same that they were not able to live under those conditions back then, you're not able to live in those conditions today. And so there is honestly no more important place to organize and to support than in the South. Than in a place where companies seek refuge, knowing that they have right to work states, where they can have temp workers at Nissan for 5 years, not receiving any benefits for their work, where you can have workers who literally die on the floor of the plant and they choose not to stop production, not even for an hour. This is what we're dealing with. And so we have to give people more voice. And so our campaign became one where we decided that we want to change the entire scope of how we see electoral politics. Bringing people into the process, giving them more control over their governance. So our campaign slogan was, when I become mayor, you become mayor. Knowing that that does not mean that we're going to have the biggest desk that we've ever seen, nor the largest office that we've ever known, but understanding that we would use a process of collective genius, knowing that we're stronger together than we are independent. I come from that organizer background that I just mentioned a moment ago, so I have a propensity to speak to the larger things in life. And so I would go door to door and talk to people about their conditions, and you start talking to people about social justice and economic equity and human rights, and so you're confronted with a brother or sister says, yeah, that's nice, young brother. But how are you going to fix that pothole in the middle of my street? Right? All right. And so what our mission becomes as organizers is meeting people where they are and speaking to the conditions that they're dealing with so that we can have true conversations and garner more respect and open up the conversation to broader subjects. So it literally becomes the objective of connecting pothole to pothole and community to community. So people in Jackson, Mississippi understand why there is a community that looks just like theirs in Detroit, Michigan, or Gary, Indiana, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or New York, New York. Understanding that the issue is that none of you actually control the conditions which lead to a pothole being fixed in the first place. You lack self-determination. And so how do we gain more control over our destinies? Our mission must be to be more self-determined and to provide human rights for human beings. And workers' rights are human rights. And that's why we have to support our workers' rights. We see the issue of workers' rights as more than just acquiring the need for dignity and respect in their jobs that they so justly deserve. But we have to see it as an opportunity for economic growth of our city. Jackson, Mississippi is like many of our cities. It's a capital city, which does not have a problem producing wealth. Jackson is a city that has a problem maintaining wealth. So all of the money that's made between 9 and 5 just happens to be out by 6. And so we have to have a strategic assessment of how we change that. Jackson has an above the average college graduation rate, so our greatest exports are our talent and our money. And so we're trying to change that dynamic, and we see an opportunity to do so by supporting our workers. We are of the mind that if you put more money in the hands of the people who live and work in the city, then you stand a greater chance of recouping more money back. And so that's why we believe that it is so important that we support our workers' rights. As we look at the dynamics of what we're confronting in these Trump times, we have to begin to create alliances that support one another. I've been asked by people, well, how does it feel in Mississippi after the Trump election? And I share quite simply that the Wednesday after the election, I woke up in Mississippi. Right? Which means no matter whether our country has experienced great booms or busts, that Mississippi has always been at the bottom. And so we have to start the process of how we begin to rescue ourselves. That's why we demand that we become the most radical city on the planet. Because people have suffered greater in places like Mississippi than anywhere else in this country. And as we look at all the great organizers in this room and consider all of the great organizers in history, we have to realize that the greatest organizer of all time is oppression. So we have to seize this opportunity right now. If not in this moment, then no moment ever will exist where we can organize people and truly articulate the true issues that they're confronting. We can't be afraid of being radical. We can't be afraid of speaking truth to people. We owe truth to people. People often label me a radical as they labeled my father a radical, and I tell them, honestly, I see it as a badge of honor. When I look through history and I see all of the people who have been called radicals out of Mississippi, you talk about labor, you talk about working together, you have to recognize the history of someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was considered a radical. Marcus Garvey, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, Jesus Christ. And so, as Melissa stated, we have to be prepared to be as radical as the circumstances dictate we should be. Supporting one another, understanding, as Martin told us, that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And in conclusion, we have to come to the analysis that Martin Luther King came to right before his dying day, where he had a discussion with Harry Belafonte. And what he told Harry, he said, listen, Harry, I believe we're going to win this integration struggle. But I'm beginning to wonder. I'm beginning to wonder if we are not integrating into a burning house. And what Martin began to see and what Martin began to realize, he began to see how a system was exploiting people. Exploiting workers and exploiting individuals' ability to make a living for themselves. And he said he feared integrating into a house that looked like that, and he feared that his dream had become a nightmare. And so ultimately we have to understand that our issues are greater than a question of race and color. And they're a question of ideas, and what are the best ideas, and what are the worst ideas, and what the worst ideas are is that you can exploit anybody. We have to move to a better choice. We have two choices. We have the choice of economics for the people and by the people, or economics by a few people for themselves. And so right now, we have to start supporting one another so that we move to those better options and those better choices. And so I'm grateful to have the support of CWA. I'm grateful to call you friends, and I look forward to the great work that we're going to do together. Thank you so much.